tens of thousands of gigatons of CO2 came out of these crazy volcanoes in Siberia, caused about 10 degrees C of global warming. That base level of CO2 that I'm talking about that's in the atmosphere, keeping it from freezing over, is provided by volcanoes in the absence of humans. So volcanoes emit CO2 at a rate that's like 1/100th what we are doing right now. There are two Snowball Earth episodes, but they happened before the age of animal life. And if that happened again, it would be, a complete apocalypse. If we don't go to another kind of energy at a same scale, and figure this out in the next few decades, it could get pretty ugly. We're currently emitting 100 times more CO2 than all the volcanoes on Earth, and it's the thing that controls the temperature of the planet. That's only as nasty as that was in Russia. You have things dying on the bottom of the ocean at the other side of the world, and so the lava can't really explain why that's happening. It'd be such a sort of cosmic shame to inherit this perfect planet that is perfect for us, and just trash the place in a couple centuries.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Science Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Muhammad Ittefaq, and Professor of Climate Communication. I go with my first name as Muhammad. So, as you know, we talk on Science Talk a lot about climate change, health, science, and technology. You always hear about, climate change and how human activities changing our climate by emitting more carbon dioxide, and how CO2 is driving rising global temperatures. We hear a lot from the news, but according to a science journalist, Peter Brannen, that familiar narrative is far too narrow. In his latest book, The Story of CO2 is the story of everything. He reframes our understanding of what may be the most vilified and misunderstood molecule on the planet Earth. A little bit about the background of Peter. He is an award-winning science journalist whose work has appeared in the top, news outlets like Atlantic, New York Times, Washington Post, and Boston Globe, including The Guardian and many others. His previous book, The Ends of the World, published back in 2017, almost 9 years ago, time flies, explored how, the five major mass extinctions in Earth's history, and his work focuses mostly on geology, ocean science, deep time, and carbon cycle. Peter, thank you so much for joining me today, and welcome to Science Talk.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. So, your book I recently came across and read, and it's excellent piece of writing. Of course, you're a master of language. I don't know much about your academic background, but it's a fascinating book, and many people I would recommend to read. And in that book, you have spoken with leading planetary scientists, and the central argument of your book, if I'm not wrong, is that the CO2 is not merely an industrial pollutant, but a key player in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth. You also argue that to understand CO2 from the deep past to the present is understand the very fabric of our world. And if I'm not wrong, my first question to explain that a little bit more, that you go from extinction to CO2. How so, and what led you to write the second book?
Yeah, well, the first book that you mentioned earlier, The Ends of the World, I wrote that book because I was hanging around with geoscientists and geologists and paleontologists in the lab and going on field work and going to conferences. And I saw that there's this emerging sort of story about the great mass extinctions in Earth history. So everyone's familiar with the one that killed the dinosaurs, but there's four others, some of which were much worse than the one that killed the dinosaurs. And there's this emerging story in the geoscience community that had sort of eerie relevance to our own time, which is that while a big space rock, hitting the planet is
Mm-hmm.
responsible for the dinosaur extinction, when scientists, in the last 30 or so years went out looking for evidence of asteroid impacts at the other extinctions, they didn't find any, and instead what they found were these really dramatic climate events that have a lot in common with what we're doing today. So there was sort of a news hook, even though these events happened hundreds of millions of years ago, they're sort of eerily relevant to our own time because in the worst mass extinction of all time, for instance, tons and tons, tens of thousands of gigatons of CO2 came out of these crazy volcanoes in Siberia, caused about 10 degrees C of global warming. So we're worried about, 2 degrees C of global warming. And so these are just really extreme experiments that show you, in the fossil record, that show you, what the end stage kind of is for if you keep running the experiment we're doing as far as we can. But what emerged out of that book was sort of this much deeper, appreciation for this thing CO2 that you read about in the news as just, yeah, this thing that comes out of smokestacks that's a byproduct of industry. And it's bad in the same way that a lot of other pollutants are bad, like mercury and things. And so we need to regulate it like all these other pollutants. But in the geoscience community, you get this much grander story about this stuff. And going to conferences and hearing talks and reading papers, this stuff, CO2, shows up in the center of every single, topic, whether it's the biochemistry of life and the origin of life through to the climate history of the whole planet has been governed by changes in CO2. And so you really can tell the story of the entire history of life on Earth through this one molecule. And so, yeah, I wanted to step back from sort of the headlines and reintroduce people to this thing that they'd read about in the context of, environmentalism or industrial pollution as, central to our understanding of what this planet even is and how it works. And, that's one of the reasons why you don't want to mess with it too much is because it is so central to the operation of the planet as it moves from the Earth's crust through the oceans and atmosphere into life and then back into the crust over these million year cycle. So yeah, I just felt this sort of burning desire to communicate what I was seeing from the geoscience world to the average reader.
Mhm. So, and from the same understanding, do you think people can use it as a flip argument that, see, even people are saying it's not that bad, we need more
Yeah.
CO2, not less. So a lot of my own conversations with experts, and there are commenters on the YouTube and other social media channels. They say like, "Oh, we need more CO2. It's not enough. We had more, and do you want to go back to ice age? What do you want to do?" So is that like, do you think there are some people who can twist this argument and say like, you know what, in the history we've been worse off than what we are now? Well, what is different than the previous times? Because on average person doesn't think much about the 4 billion years of history of Earth. We think more about the everyday, what we eat, what we do, and the things.
Yeah, there is a way that if you know very little about geological history, you can say factually accurate things to make it seem like modern climate change isn't a big deal, that once you dig into them, as I do in the book, I
Mhm.
demonstrate just why these analogies are so, misguided. So for instance, you'll hear CO2 is plant food, what's the
Mhm.
big deal? And, of course it's plant food because CO2 is sort of the substrate of all life. Life is carbon based and it's made out of CO2. That has nothing to do with its importance to, the how scary climate change is or anything. And then the other thing you'll hear is that, oh, well, look, CO2 has been much higher in the past. 50 million years ago, it was, 1,000 parts per million, and today it's 400 parts per million. And life was happy then. And, what's the big deal if we make it, a little higher CO2 and a little warmer? But then you think about that for a few seconds and it starts to not make any sense because 50 million years ago, yes, CO2 was around 1,000 parts per million for, humans weren't around yet. So the reasons were tectonic and planetary for, CO2 shifts subtly its level in the atmosphere over hundreds of millions of years. And in the Eocene, 50 million years ago, when CO2 was that high, there were crocodiles in the Arctic Circle, and there were, sand tiger sharks in the Arctic Circle, and palm trees in Alaska. And we know that because you can look at the fossil record in those places when the latitude of, where those land masses were was basically the same as today. So we know it was way warmer. And then you just think, okay, if we jacked up CO2 from 400 today to 1,000 parts per million in the next century, and you reverse the evolution of the climate by 50 million years to suddenly we're going to go from a world with, mile thick ice sheet on Antarctica and Greenland and the grain belts where the agricultural grain belts where they are today to the Eocene world of alligators in the Arctic Circle and tropics being basically uninhabitable for mammals like us. What that climate shock would do in a century and a half, that's basically unprecedented from the entire history of animal life, except for maybe the big mass extinctions, that you never see climate shocks that rapid. And life can adapt to changes in climate.
Yeah.
Over the past few million years, we've been going out of these in and out of these big ice ages, and life has, for the most part, kept up. But it also has speed limits that took place over thousands of years. And if you just suddenly, impose on the planet a climate it hasn't seen in tens of millions of years since, the greenhouse that was left over from the age of dinosaurs, if you impose that on what is essentially still an ice age world today, in a matter of centuries, it's just a shock that you don't see. And life can, the big mass extinctions seem to be what happens when, you go past this speed limit for life's adaptability to changes on the planet. And I think that would qualify as one if you suddenly change the climate by that much.
So the CO2, as you argued in the book, is very important, essential for life on Earth, and it may not be possible without that, right? So, but why do you think it has become one of the most vilified molecules, or why do you think CO2 is misunderstood in today's world? And because when we talk about climate change, yes, it's carbon dioxide, but we don't hear that like there are some benefits and there is a safe level of it, what we need and how much we need.
Yeah.
So what are some of the misunderstandings, and what are you trying to convey through this book?
Yeah, I mean, so there are these two miraculous features of this stuff that if just one gas did one of these things would be incredible. One of them is, like I was saying before, it is the source of all carbon for all life on Earth, and life is carbon based. And it's sort of the at the heart of all life, there's carbon chemistry going on that is fundamentally rooted through CO2. Okay, we can talk about that at some point, but the other amazing thing is that in times when it isn't going out of control, being erupted by tons of volcanoes or by smokestacks and things and changing the temperature really quickly, it's maintained a habitable temperature for animal life over hundreds of millions of years. So animal life is sort of finicky. We need to live within a pretty narrow temperature range. And for the most part, over the last, 550 million years, the planet has maintained that very narrow temperature range. And CO2 is, as one famous paper put it, the principal control knob governing Earth's temperature. And that's not an overstatement. It really is the dominant thing that dictates what the temperature is going to be like on the planet. And to give you some idea of how narrow that
Mhm.
window is that the planet has to maintain, when it has been when there's been 0.1% of the atmosphere has been CO2, there was this greenhouse world I was just talking about where there's crocodiles in the Arctic Circle and there's no ice anywhere on the planet. So that's 0.1% of the atmosphere. 0.018% of the atmosphere is the opposite world. There's mile thick ice sheets on top of, where I live in Boston, maybe half mile. In Chicago, it's a mile. You had an Antarctica's worth of ice on North America. This is the last, the depth of the last ice age. Sea level's 400 feet lower. There's a quarter less vegetation. It's a dry, shrubby world with mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses. And so those are two drastically different worlds, and it's less than a, percentage point change in this gas. So it's incredible that when you veer too far in either direction, we know from when CO2 drops too far, you can go into a thing called snowball Earth, where the whole planet freezes over. And that would probably be the end of all animal life if that happened. There are two Snowball Earth episodes, but they happened before the age of animal life. And if that happened again, it would be, a complete apocalypse. So it's a good thing that there's some of this stuff in the atmosphere to keep the planet from freezing over. If you took it all out of the atmosphere, you'd go back into a Snowball Earth within like 50 years or something. And then when it veers too far in the other direction, you get these big mass extinctions that I was talking about when it just gets too hot for most life on Earth. And it maintains this miraculous balance otherwise over hundreds of millions of years, where it's never veered too far in either direction through this grand sort of tectonic and this kind of ballet of the planet that includes the oceans and the atmosphere and life and tectonics.
Mhm.
That has this horribly boring name called the silicate weathering cycle, which geologists just need to do a better job of branding some of this stuff because I find it totally mind blowing, but it's hard to
Yeah.
convince people, organic chemistry or the silicate weathering cycle
Mhm.
is actually, interesting. But it really is. It's this thing that acts as a thermostat. That base level of CO2 that I'm talking about that's in the atmosphere, keeping it from freezing over, is provided by volcanoes in the absence of humans. So volcanoes emit CO2 at a rate that's like 1/100th what we are doing right now, ordinarily.
Mhm.
And that keeps the planet from freezing over, and it doesn't make it too hot because there's also other processes going on the Earth that are sequestering it away. So it's very finely and balanced. And those processes are things called rock, this thing called rock weathering, which is just what it sounds like, which is that CO2 reacts with rain and makes it slightly more acidic, and it breaks down rocks. And then you get this chemical transformation where those products are washed by rivers into the ocean. And eventually, the CO2 that was once in the atmosphere gets transformed, often by life in the ocean, by things that make shells, into calcium carbonate, and it gets sequestered away. And this is an amazing thing because it's a thermostat. If CO2 gets too high, if volcanoes suddenly put it out too much, or even if humans do, it makes the planet warmer, as we know, and that it causes the water cycle to speed up, so you get more evaporation and precipitation, which actually speeds up this rock weathering cycle, which sequesters more CO2
Mhm.
elsewhere on the planet. So this is the planet's thermostat that's maintained this equilibrium for so long. The problem with it, and the reason why it's not going to get us out of
Mhm.
trouble in the near term, is that these are processes that take place over 100,000,
Mm.
year time scale. So eventually, like other crazy warming events you find in the fossil record, this you'll see this mechanism in action where you'll see, oh, there's a weird little ocean acidification event, and then 100,000 years later, ocean chemistry goes back to normal and the temperature drops, and that's going to happen if we, disappear tomorrow.
Mm.
And this is what happens in all the other, crazy warming events. So it's incredible that the Earth has this, safety switch, and it has all these ways of recovering after extreme perturbations like the ones we're running on now. It's just not relevant to human timescales because
Mm.
we don't get to live on 100,000 year timescales. We get to live on decadal timescales,
Yes.
and in the time being, things are going totally out of control.
So that's fascinating, and that's interesting. And I think I hear that argument, from some of the people that this Earth has its own mechanism to, adjust and evolve, but we may not see it because humans are not. We don't have a
Yeah.
millions of years to live. We just like 60 years, 80 years,
Right, right.
and leave the Earth. But does it also show that because I'm trying to understand the concern here, people who are like, really telling us the climate communication perspective that the CO2 is really bad, it's gonna
Mm,
like raise the temperature and the sea level and like more flooding and more stronger hurricanes and all that stuff, and it's gonna damage more, and it's going to cost us billions and hundreds of
hmm
billions of dollars, right? But on the other hand, you see when you talk with geologists, people who study the earth systems and things, it's like, hold on, we're not going to go, like vanish from this planet in next 20, 30 years or 40, 50 years, but there will be some changes which are irreversible by the
hmm
human action. My question to you, do you think, for example, what level we have right now, CO2 in the atmosphere, it doesn't go away for hundreds of thousands of years, right? It stays up there. Do you think humans as a Homo sapiens, we have a capability of maybe adapting or coming up with some sort of solution before it's too late, or is it already too late? According to many, which I have talked to, they say it's too late and we can't do much about it. Where do you
Yeah.
stand on that?
Well, just to go back to an earlier thing that you're saying, that geologists have sort of this more sanguine view than which I don't. I actually think it's the opposite. That what I might have just said sounds sort of consoling because I'm saying in the long run everything's going to be fine. But what's worrying about what we're doing today is that it's almost geologically unprecedented,
Hmm.
and we know that when you tweak these, turn these knobs too fast, you can break the whole system,
Yes.
which is what happens in the big mass extinctions. And our best estimate is that we are currently emitting CO2 10 times faster than those big mass extinctions caused by CO2.
Wow.
So even though they emitted far more, I mean, it got a lot hotter and it got a lot warmer. That was over tens of thousands of years.
Hmm.
And what we're doing is, it's not as much yet, but it's faster. And
Hmm.
speed really matters for the Earth's ability to regulate this stuff or to wash it out of the system. And so acidification, like for ocean acidification, what happens with CO2 reacts with seawater, it's really the rate more than the total volume of CO2 that you put
Hmm.
out. And given that the rate right now
The
is
speed. You mean the
the
speed,
speed,
right?
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah. And the speed of what we're doing, we look to these ancient events for some guidance into what can happen, but they happen on very ancient Earths. And so the planet didn't work quite the same way, but also we're just faster. And so the
Hmm.
scary thing about what we're doing is it is a literal like no analog situation in, at least 500 million years of Earth history, the whole age of animal life. So that's the stuff that keeps me up at night, that when you see projections for the future, they're based on our understanding of, the Earth as it's always behaved, but we're pushing it in ways that it's literally never, almost never seen before.
Hmm.
So that's the first part. And then the second part about humans' adaptability. I go back and forth on this, I guess, like based on my mood, whether I'm feeling pessimistic or optimistic. There's things even from our own evolutionary history that I guess you could view as encouraging, that we evolved in this really volatile ice age climate that was pretty miserable, and it seemed like, the reasons why we evolved the way we did, to have these big clever brains and use tools and be social and have language, were, I mean, I would think they were adaptations against a very unpleasant world. So it really was our like cleverness, not the fact that we had big fangs or fur or anything that kept us alive in the ice age. It was the fact that we were incredibly adaptable to really wild regional climate shifts, and over thousands of years, planetary climate shifts. So that's what's kept us alive as a species so far. So I'm kind of the least, relevant person to talk to about the news because I am as bewildered by the next few decades as anyone else. But when I just sort of start to think about the next few centuries to millennia, I think humans will ultimately, and maybe it's not a good thing that it seems like we need to be pushed pretty hard before we really start innovating and adapting our way out of, rough times in our past.
Mhm.
But I think ultimately we'll figure out a way of living on this planet that is more in equilibrium with it. I just don't know what that looks like, and yeah, I don't think we're going to go extinct. I think there's a lot of this, glib talk that humans are going to go extinct. But if anything, this isn't the most flattering way to look at us. But if you study what survives mass extinctions, it's usually things that are geographically widespread, have big populations, are generalists and like jack of all trades and are adaptable. And that kind of just perfectly summarizes humans. So
Mhm.
I don't, we could make life pretty miserable for a lot of life on Earth, but I think we're here to stay probably as a species.
Yeah. So, and it's not only about us, it's also about the other species, right? The nature which is surrounded. So are you like any shape or form concerned? Because I talked with, ecologists, and they're very concerned about
Hmm.
industrial civilization and what it has done to the planet and the nature in general. So many ecologists, they argue. You talk with, other people. I talked with a couple of ecologists, and they argued like the speed of extracting resources and the amount of extracting resources from the finite planet or the Earth is also this trajectory cannot be continue in any shape or form because it's gonna risk some sort of collapse. How do you see that debate, looking at what human industrial civilization has done to the planet in general?
Yeah, I totally agree. There's this debate about this term, the Anthropocene or Anthropocene, whether are we living in a new epoch? And a lot of geologists don't like that term. Some of them do, but some of them, myself included, I'd put myself in this camp that I sort of bristle at the idea that we're in a new epoch because it gives us credit for, what we're doing right now is basically on a geologically nanosecond time scale. And we're deranging the Earth cycles at such a speed that it's just not durable into anything like geological time. So speaking about our current, you know, infinitesimal moment on this planet when we're driving it totally out of control, as equivalent to the late Cretaceous, which is 45 million years long. We've given ourselves too much credit for being a, geologically relevant
Yeah.
species, I think, when we start talking about the Anthropocene. And yeah, when you look at things like, not only can the CO2 not just keep going up for millions of years, like you'd create Venus, but yeah, we fertilize our crops with phosphate and nitrogen and stuff, and that washes into the ocean. And already since 1960, the oceans have lost 2% of their oxygen from nutrient pollution and warming. And so that's a like instantaneous sort of drop in oxygen. And if you like plot that out a few hundred centuries to millennia, you're going into like a ocean anoxic event, which you only see once every 100 million years or so in Earth history. So nothing we're doing on the planet can persist for much longer. So at the speed and scale that it's going, and no exponential curve in nature ever just keeps going up forever. So I don't know what it looks like when that curve starts to plateau or, God forbid, just start plummeting. But clearly, if you come back in a few thousand years, you're not going to see the same sort of civilization that you see today if there are humans around. And hopefully it doesn't take too much of a devastating correction to figure out a way to live on the planet, but it's not sustainable indefinitely.
And you think like it's not only like for humans but other species as well.
Yeah.
And one of the things we're doing that is burning fossil fuel, right? The rate and the speed again, and the scale, of course. And if you looked at the history of the Earth, right? So, what do you think for the audience that teaches us about burning too much fossil fuel? Is it sustainable, or do you have any hope that we will stop at some point when we see the clean energy or revolution in renewable energy, or you think we are going to keep burning fossil fuel until the last drop of oil dried up from this planet, and then maybe it's like too, it's kind of too far from a geological or ecological disaster.
Yeah. Well, there's two there's two reasons why we can't just keep burning it. One is all the scary climate reasons I've said so far. That we're currently emitting 100 times more CO2 than all the volcanoes on Earth, and it's the thing that controls the temperature of the planet. So you just can't do that too long without, frying the planet. But then the other problem is that so far we've been extracting stuff that's been pretty easy to extract.
Yes.
When you read about the wildcatters out in the, Texas or whatever, drilling for oil in the 20s and 30s, they were just putting these very crude things down on the ground and hitting these oceans of oil. And, discoveries of new oil fields peaked in the 60s,
Mhm.
and all the easy stuff's been tapped. And there's a reason why you have oil companies, thinking about doing these crazy things like going to the Arctic and melting
Mhm.
the ground to get
Yeah.
into the oil, and or building these incredible, multi-billion dollar offshore rigs to dig miles
Mhm.
below the ocean and seabed, because all the easy stuff's gone. And at a
Mhm.
certain point, it becomes unprofitable. If you're putting more energy into getting oil out of the ground than you're getting out of the oil, it doesn't make any sense at all. You might as well just be burning wood or something. So there's some people who worry, and there are these debates about whether this is like a near-term thing, like it's in the next few decades, or we're still hundreds of years from this. But again, I'm from a geology perspective, where few hundred years is nothing. That there
Yeah.
just isn't there's a finite amount of the stuff that will be economically extractable, and we might be already getting close to it. So, people make a big deal of the fracking,
Mhm.
you know, in the past 10, 15 years, but though that is a much different prospect than the big oil fields in the 20th century. Though they're more expensive to drill, they don't last nearly as long.
Mhm.
I think they lose half their production after a year or something like that. So there's all sorts of reasons to think that, given that we're an incredibly energetic industrial society, if we don't go to another kind of energy at a
Mhm.
same scale, and figure this out in the next few decades, it could get pretty ugly, if we suddenly just have the power cut off to all of human civilization. And that is one argument for renewable energy you almost never hear, but it is true that, like, we need to, even if there was no climate effects at all, we need to get off this, our addiction to this carbon that's in the ground. And then I'm encouraged by the fact that, solar panels and batteries and EVs are getting so cheap.
Mhm.
And it does seem like it's just better technology. It delivers more power that, if we were a wiser
Mhm.
species, we would make the switch out of, just, being wise and not wanting to destroy the planet. But it might be that, just the economics that could really just blow fossil fuels out of the water. And we just, even if we have, someone who doesn't have an environmental bone in their body is just going to make the switch because, an EV is just a much better car than a gas
Yeah.
burning one. So
And it,
we'll
it may
see in
not
the,
be like,
yeah,
well, like
yeah,
we have to be wise. It's just like common sense too.
yeah,
Something cannot continue to go on forever, right? It's
right,
going to run
right.
run out at some point. And the climate conversations are too often are locked into, the temperatures again. But do you think, like, for example, if we see the carbon cycles, that's one of your areas, and the economic systems tied to it. And it's a very kind of complicated kind of relationship between CO2 or not CO2, like overall fossil fuel and our economic systems and overall energy demands are rising due to, like a lot of AI and data centers. I know
Hmm.
you don't focus much on that, but like if we look at the complication or complex relationship between our global carbon cycles and energy demands as well as economic system, where do you think the transition may happen, in the clean energy in the next 20 to 30 to 50 years? But how is our economic system are going to adapt to those things, what we're seeing in next 2 to 3 decades?
If it's supplying an equivalent amount of energy or even more than fossil fuel system, I think there'll be no problem adapting to it. Because in my book, I make this argument that is not mine, but that all animals eat what is originally plants that take CO2 and they make organic carbon, they make plant stuff. Animals eat that plant stuff, or they eat the things that eat plant stuff, like, carnivores do. And they burn it in their metabolism back to CO2 to power their own lives and release what was originally sunlight captured by the plants, and they release the CO2 that the plants caught, and that powers us. And that's powered all animal life, and it's powered all of human history too, because in the book I do this sort of speed run through the rise of agriculture and these burgeoning empires and this world that was still powered by plants, but they're agricultural crops. We were suddenly able to grow a lot more calories and feed a lot more people, and turn more and more of the planet into food for humans or into animals like, cows that can eat stuff that we can't, to turn it into food for humans, to, feed armies and fishermen and bureaucrats. And so civilization's always been carbon powered. And the Industrial Revolution, that world was always constrained by how many plants you could grow on the Earth's surface. That's how big the any quote unquote economy could get. And then what was the complete game changer of the Industrial Revolution is that there are far, far, far more plants in the Earth's crust than there are at the Earth's surface. And there are these things, fossil fuels. They're ancient plants, like coal are ancient swamp forests, and oil is ancient, algae in the ocean. And so suddenly that limit was completely blown away by society, where previously 90% of society had to farm to support, a 10% that could be specialists or, elites or whatever, to a situation where now we're, very few people relatively on Earth farm, but somehow population has exploded by the billions, and we're doing more than we've ever done. And that's because we've unleashed all the plant energy in the history of life on Earth. And the unavoidable respiration of burning plants, just like it is when we eat them, is CO2. And so the reason why there's this exact relationship so far between CO2 going up and, the global economy just taking off is because what has powered that exponential rise has been the release of all this ancient plant power. And so if we suddenly ditch that source of energy for another one that's just as big, and then I don't see any, I don't think there will be any hiccups at all other than the vested interests and sort of the dying industries of fossil fuel interests and stuff like that, that you're seeing sort of play out today in geopolitics, that it could be a pretty nasty last, gasp for some of these industries in their fight to stay relevant and keep making profits. So that is where
Of
the
course.
that's where the trouble is.
Yeah. So you have said recently that I'm quoting, there are precedents in the geological record for what's happening now, and looking at them is pretty terrifying, unquote.
Mhm.
Can you explain like what are those precedents are and why do they matter in our understanding today?
Yeah. Well, this one I've mentioned a few times that I wrote about in the first book because it's the biggest mass extinction of all time. And I write about in this book as well because it is, fundamentally a story about carbon dioxide. And it is this weird thing called the end Permian mass extinction that happened 252 million years ago, which is it's before dinosaurs evolve, but it's the biggest mass extinction by far. It takes 10 million years for the planet to recover. You see all sorts of scary things at the boundary where, most life goes, 90% of life on Earth goes extinct. Where there are once sort of beautiful reefs all over the planet, you replace them with bacterial slime all over the planet, which basically you don't see in the age of animal life. It sort of had disappeared once animals show up. Then it shows up right after this extinction because it's so nasty. And that one, like I was saying, people looked for evidence of an asteroid impact and they couldn't find it. And instead, what they find is across most of Siberia, you have this weird volcanic rock, and it dates exactly to the time of the extinction. And it's from these continent-spanning series of eruptions called the Siberian Traps, where enough lava erupted out of Russia that it could have covered the lower 48 United States a kilometer deep in magma and lava. So it's just an unprecedented amount of volcanism. But that's only as nasty as that was in Russia. You have things dying on the bottom of the ocean at the other side of the world. And so the lava can't really explain why that's happening. And it's the gases that were coming out of these volcanoes that were killing everything. And the most important one is CO2, because on the way up, the magma would have been burning through on its way up to the surface of the Earth, all these ancient fossil fuels and all this limestone, and basically acting like industrial civilization, but 250 million years before we were around, just burning lots of fossil fuels, emitting tons and tons of CO2 and lots of methane at the surface. And over tens of thousands of years, the temperature, as I said, goes up by something like 10 degrees C, starting from a pretty similar climate as what we have today, somewhat like relatively similar compared to other periods of Earth history. Um, and you see the oceans acidify and lose their oxygen, and all these things that we are starting to see the first glimmers of today on our planet. Like I said, the planet is the oceans lost some oxygen already. The oceans have gotten 30% more acidic since the start of the Industrial Revolution, which is a result of CO2 reacting with seawater. And we've seen 2 degrees of warming in a century and a half, 2 centuries, which is an incredibly fast jump. And so if we go down this path any further, the end Permian's just showing this is literally the worst thing that's ever happened in the history of the planet, and it was driven by the carbon cycle, completely spinning out of control from overwhelming it with too much CO2. So while CO2 keeps the place habitable and makes Earth Earth in normal times, because it's so important that if you just like jackknife this cycle with way, way, way too much, more than it can accommodate, it can literally kill almost everything on Earth. So I don't think we're going to reproduce the end Permian mass extinction. I think that's sort of the most extreme things can get on the planet. But it is, the thing I was saying earlier that even though those volcanoes are really crazy, we're still faster than those. So
Mm.
that is worrying. And it's just that it's a no analog situation. It's probably not going to be, the continents have moved around a lot since Pangea, and there's different things living in the ocean that affect the carbon cycle totally differently than they worked back then. So it's really a different planet in a lot of ways, but we know enough to know that clearly this is a dangerous experiment we're running.
We are on the wrong trajectory. Two questions out of that. How do you process all of this information? It's so much. And the follow-up question related to that, like ordinary people in the US or in the West, you're throwing like a million, hundreds of millions of
Yeah.
years of history. Why do you think they should care about Earth's history? Because many people would find like that's like 4 billion years, like 250 million years ago,
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
happened, and now we're talking in 2026. Um, and there was like maybe no Homo sapiens, or maybe there were,
Yeah. Yeah.
like it's hard to tell, but why, how do you keep up with this information and keep up your mental health and physical health with that?
Yeah.
And the second is, why do you think an ordinary American should, or ordinary citizen of this earth should care about the Earth's history?
Well, the first, I would say my mental and physical health did not do great when I was writing the book. It
No.
was a long, arduous process. Um, Mostly because, yeah, I mean, I was trying to synthesize a lot of information and it was a lot to organize. And so it was
Of
pretty
course.
maddening experience trying to synthesize everything and pull it all together. Um, but I guess there are certainly more relevant or like immediately relevant to your own life
Mhm.
books about climate change
Yes.
or um, than mine. And it's because I came to it from sort of a weird angle where I always have been drawn to stories about our origins and
Mhm.
how does the planet work and more like sort of this cosmic scale stuff. And I've accidentally had to start writing about, current events.
Mm.
So I really came to this book from sort of like a sense of cosmic wonder about how the whole thing works,
Mm.
how the planet works, and why it is this one sort of miraculous thing is at the
Yeah.
center, this carbon dioxide stuff. And so I was just sort of motivated by that and hoping that other people who are just generally interested
Mhm.
about, our origins and where we came
Mhm.
from and what's going on in this universe,
Yeah.
they'd come to it from that perspective. So it's been an interesting exercise trying to market it because, I'll come on podcasts and stuff and people want to know about, what's all right, China's manufacturing this year. Are they going to say us?
Yes.
And
Yes.
and
More
I really
contemporary stuff. Yeah. More
yeah,
contemporary
but
stuff.
it shows you that what an all-encompassing topic this that climate and carbon dioxide and this stuff really is, that it really touches on everything, and that
Mhm.
someone like me who comes to it from planetary sciences is motivated to write about it just as much as someone who's a labor reporter or
Yeah.
a industrial business reporter. They write about it in their own way, and I think it requires all approaches.
Mhm.
Some people will want to just read about the economics of it, but you know, I love geology because anywhere you go, and I've been to James Madison actually. I went there for a conference on the Ordovician geology around there.
Oh, okay. That's nice. It's a beautiful
Y-
campus, yes.
Yeah, yeah. We hiked around some limestone caves and stuff, and
Yeah.
so. But anywhere you go, if you look up the story of the rocks underneath your feet, you're going to find out this like science fiction story from hundreds of millions of
Mhm.
years ago with all these alien planets and
Yeah.
in James Madison it was under a shallow sea with all these alien squid-like and horseshoe crab-looking things and so I mean I was always a science fiction fan and stuff, so that's why I love geology. And for me, it's sort of been a Trojan horse being able to write about climate change with this context because I'll find people will pick up my book because they like dinosaurs or they like geology.
Mhm.
And some of them will be oil geologists, and they'll write to me and they'll be like, they had had a story of climate change that was presented in a certain way where it's talked about as this thing that's theoretical on computer models and it's in the
Mhm.
future. And when I'm talking in their language about stuff that they love, it's sort of reframed the topic for them that, it isn't just theoretical. If you go to a rock and you understand how to read it, you can see that the similar experiments been run on the planet before. And so while some people will be more motivated by
Mhm.
other sort of calls to action, I find, and maybe this is just a self-justifying thing to keep writing from this weird perspective on it, but some people seem more receptive to the message through this story of the history of life on Earth.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I was fascinated because like the title of the book, the story of CO2 is the story of everything. It's amazing title. It's very sellable, but most often I kind of go see like why there is no life on other planets,
mm,
why we
yeah,
haven't found any other species on other planets. It's like kind of
mm,
fascinating stuff if you think about or spend some time, but unfortunately this modern technological society has kept us so busy, so
I
we
know.
don't think about many other things. So the question I always ask, you hinted a little bit earlier, what keep you at night up at night and what give you a good night's sleep? As a writer who look at the history of the earth, of the planet, and our future maybe. So realistically, tell us a little bit about your optimism or pessimism, how you kind of go about it.
Well, I think what keeps me up at night is the same stuff that keeps everyone up at night. The headlines we're all reading today, like
Hmm.
even today, the administration being sounding completely deranged, talking about world events, and it, in a more optimistic moods, like I was saying, I am optimistic about ourselves as a species because we're super smart and we're adaptable and we're clever, and I know that we could figure this out,
Hmm.
and which is why it's so dispiriting to see really just incurious, stupid people screwing things up constantly.
Yeah.
So that's what I guess gets me down is that, our potential is so amazing and it's like squandered by just the most venal, horrible people on earth. But then I guess the I guess the optimism is so well no human has lived I mean, or the thing that I try to hold on to is that while no human being has lived through a planetary change of this scale before, lots of human beings have lived through
Mm.
regional climate events that would have struck them as just as catastrophic as what we're living through today. And sometimes, there are these cold snaps that some people have associated with, like, the 30 Years' War, the fall of the Ming Dynasty and stuff. And so clearly there are cataclysms for human societies, but I don't think anyone in those societies, they didn't love their family any less. They didn't find little joys in their life as any less. And so sometimes you'll hear talk about climate change where it's like, oh, I shouldn't even have a family or I shouldn't.
Yeah.
And I think, you only get to live on a personal scale and a personal time scale and you don't get to live a planetary time scale over decades. And so I don't think we should lose fact of how important the things are in
Mhm.
our own life while we are rightfully scared by the general trends on the planet. I don't know if that made any sense, but
No, it does. It
yeah.
does, honestly, because I sometimes I'm thinking like, should I become a news avoider? Like avoid the news completely for my own mental and physical health, but you can't, unfortunately, and that's the struggle we're living through. And every day there's something, there's something, and but we live as kind of long term optimism, like maybe things will get better. But my last question to you is about the future of supercontinent. Is there any future supercontinent continent coming before we leave this earth, or there's no possibility There's a geological time scale and there's our own time scale.
Yeah.
But because it has been in the past, and you talked about that a little bit. And when I looked up, it was fascinating. Like all the world is together, but I don't know, like it looks nice, all the countries are together. So like less
Yeah.
disputes, like you go 20 like on an hour's flight. I don't want to do that. It's just like you take,
Right.
road trip or bike or something.
Yeah.
But is there any chance in the possibility in the future?
Yeah. Well, when you put it that way, you make supercontinents sound pretty nice. But
Yes.
from what we know, the geological records, you don't really want to be in a supercontinent. The last one was associated with this big mass extinction, and then one before that was Snowball Earth. So right now we're pretty much as we're midway. There's this thing called the supercontinent cycle,
Mhm.
and they're usually about once every 500 million years. The continents will break up and then they'll come together. And so the last one was Pangea, which started breaking up around 200 million years ago. And right now we're sort of midway through the cycle where all the
Oh.
continents are pretty dispersed.
Mm.
And people have actually tried to figure out where the tectonic
Then-
boundaries are and where continents are moving. And you do have these future reconstructions that in around 250 million years ago, we're all going to be back in basically a rerun of Pangea. They call it Pangea Ultima, but that's a long way away.
who
And
keeps
yeah.
up on how who keeps up that information? Who are the people who just kind of looking at the mapping of these continents?
I mean, they're super. Well, the people who do it in the past are, that is an entire skill on its own because you have these minerals and rocks, these iron minerals that are basically like little magnets that can show you where the poles were at the time, and so people can reconstruct latitudes and which ways things were facing. But then, we know things like the San Andreas Fault, California sort of sliding this way, and you have this Rift Valley in East Africa where it's kind of pulling apart, and
Mhm.
Australia is sort of drifting towards Asia. So people have, and it's very speculative, and they've sort of just done it for their own amusement, but have sort of plotted all these going forward in the future. And there's this crazy paper that came out last year or the year before where they actually run a climate model on the supercontinent in the future, taking into account the fact that the sun will be about like 2% brighter or something like that. And it's a really nasty place. It's incredibly hot. You probably just have, if mammals are even around, they're probably just at the poles. And so we don't want the next supercontinent to come
Yeah.
too quick. It's good that it's pretty far off in the future.
Yeah, we don't want to live in the oven. That's not
No,
fun.
no, no.
So my last question to you is, what is something you think as a society we need to talk more, and we're not spending as much time as we should be?
I think it's appreciation for the Earth system and how miraculous it is. And so this is why I think while my sort of cosmic perspective on climate change might seem kind of irrelevant, if anything, it just drives home how urgent and sort of cosmically urgent the problem is. Because when you learn about Earth history, it's a miracle that we're here having this conversation. And I left writing this book process just feeling incredibly grateful to even be alive because
Mhm.
we've been gifted this perfect planet where we have these like very finely
Yeah.
balanced cycles,
Mhm.
and we just totally take it for granted. And I think once you appreciate how special this place is, the urge to be responsible stewards for it and keep it a special place, it just sort of, at least for me, it sort of redoubled my, how much I care about climate change because it is such a miraculous place, and it would be such a sort of cosmic shame to inherit this perfect planet that is perfect for us,
Mhm.
and just trash the place in a couple centuries. And this is also why I roll my eyes when people talk about Mars, where it's like, oh, we're going to terraform it. We're going to make it
Mhm.
raise the temperature by like 70 degrees C and hit the bullseye, and it's going to be perfect for us. And we can't even keep this perfect place within a few
Yes.
degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
So I used to be a kid who was obsessed with space and aliens, and the more I learn about this place, the more I realize that this really is
A
at
special,
least
beautiful
a
planet.
special, beautiful
Yes.
place. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're the second person after Elizabeth Colbert. When I talked with her, she said that too. She said it's interesting and it's a beautiful planet, and we don't appreciate as much. And the
Mhm.
Mars and other planets is the BS. These tech bros
Yeah.
are just
Yeah. Yeah.
telling us those
Yeah.
things. Not
Yeah.
gonna happen. But we have to leave it there. Thank you so
Great.
much. Again, it was honor and pleasure talking to you. And I will tell my audience that if you haven't looked at or read or kind of came across with the book, The Story of CO2 is the Story of Everything, please check it out. It's been a few months, it's out. So, Peter, thank you so much again for all the work you do. and hope things will be okay for us. So thank you so much for that message. And you said beautifully at the end that we underappreciate the things this planet Earth offer us as a human and other species. So thank you so much.